Well, thank you so much, Paul, for coming back on More Than a Muse. This is, I think, the third time we've
Mhm.
chatted, and we always love having you back, and especially with our theme of March Madness. Before Stauney, you hopped on the call, she was telling us that March Madness is a big deal where she's at because I don't remember. It's like UConn, is that you said?
UConn. Yeah,
UConn,
Yeah.
UConn
yep,
is the
big.
men's team. Well, both of the teams are amazing, but
Yes.
the men's
Mhm.
team is number one, and I live
Oh,
near
awesome.
Not basketball associated, obviously, but we're
there.
all
Mhm.
about women's rage, feminine rage, and thank you so much for coming on and being our visual artist expert. Is if we need
Absolutely.
visual artist help, we're always going to you, and Less Than Half, it's amazing everything that you do. So again, thank you for being here.
Absolutely. Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Yeah, and I
Mhm.
do think it's the third time. Once it was
First,
all about Linda
yeah,
Nochlin, and this
yeah.
is such an interesting subject. I think that the more I looked into it, the more excited I got. So I'm very happy
Oh,
to share
good.
just like a little
Yay.
sliver of my findings.
Yeah,
No.
that's how we feel about it, like, that's why we had to theme a whole month around it. There's so much actually when you dive into it, and
Mhm.
I'm really excited to hear what you found.
Yeah, absolutely. I almost think there's like a spectrum of
Yeah.
Mhm.
rage and anger, and I think that we interpret uh anger is coming from women very or what we interpret it as anger from women is sometimes not anger.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
think it sort of starts in a place where just sort of like general common courtesy when women demand it, we think of that as anger. And
Mhm.
Mhm.
I think of it's sort of like if you're not being pleasant and smiling, you must be angry. Like of course everyone knows that, the guy in the street telling you to smile,
Yep.
Mhm.
that sort of thing, as if like if your face isn't in like a grin, you're probably an angry bitch. And
Yep.
Yes.
that type of thing, I think, of course, art is a reflection of life, so that happens a lot in art where a woman is getting criticized for just you know, demanding respect
Yeah.
that
Mhm.
she deserves. I've interacted with different artists where I've asked them to do things or have talked to them about just interacting with the art world generally. And they sometimes, I'll get a response where it's like, I'm not, I won't do something without pay. And
Yeah.
that feels like, oh, well, she's just ungrateful, angry,
Mhm.
woman artist. She should just know that, exposure is important. And it's like, no, people
Yeah.
do work. This is their
Mhm.
profession. They deserve to be paid for it. And that's not an angry thing. I think particularly right now about the artist Adrian Piper, who is a American artist, Black American artist. She has not been in the United States for like several decades because she sort of disagrees politically with
Mhm.
um, the way the country is, especially in relation to race and gender. And she's lived in Germany for decades, and she didn't even come back for her retrospective at MoMA, which was like 5 years ago or
Wow.
something. She
Wow.
like Zoom conference in to answer questions. And that to me, like you could look at that as being like, oh my God, like she is so, that's anger.
Angry. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But
You can put a lot of, like, qualifiers on that would, like, diminish very valid feelings.
totally, exactly. And I think especially there's a even more of a trope or like a stereotype of like the angry black woman. I think that's
Mhm.
something that um is even more sort of emphasized and unfair. So yeah, I think that's sort of like the beginning of the spectrum. It's like it's not actually anger, it's just like valid concern and
Yes.
Mhm.
Mhm.
actions in reaction to that concern. She has actually at the retrospective at MoMA, I really loved it because there are the little things you could take home with you. And one of them was this like little card. She was a sort of performance artist, very philosophically informed. She had a PhD in philosophy. I mean, she's still alive, has a PhD in philosophy from Harvard. And you really get a sense of that like, deep, deep thinking,
Mhm.
which is sort of, I think it would be interesting to talk later about like the difference between, anger as like an emotion and then like intellectual anger. Because
Mhm.
Yes.
I think a
Mhm.
lot of women feel like they have to sort of step away from the emotional part and
Yeah.
contextualize their anger in like intellectual or philosophical ideas or even ways of expressing it because like emotional anger is what is ignored,
And
especially from a woman.
and
Yeah.
also, yeah, it's like how can I make sure that it's still taken seriously and that people are listening? And like if it's emotional, then it could be seen as reactionary and yeah, not as valid. So I think that's a really good
Yeah.
point.
Well, even I know we've covered
Absolutely.
before, like, the history of hysteria and, like, how entwined that is with women's anger, but it's crazy how many times when women are showing valid emotions, they're still considered hysterical by, like, the media and everything. It's showing that it really hasn't changed that much on how women are viewed when they show anger.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that's an
Right.
interesting way of like
Exactly.
intellectualizing it then. So then you
Yeah.
can present it prettier,
Right.
perhaps, in a different way. I love that.
E exactly, exactly. So I'll just finish what I was gonna say about
Yeah.
you
Oh,
know, because
yeah.
I have so many things. But anyway, at the retrospective, there were these little cards that
Mm.
she was a performance artist, she is a performance artist, so a lot of her work is about, like, being, like, on the ground, like, pointing things out, like, in real time, pointing out hypocrisy and racism and sexism in real time. So I wish I had it with me, but I have this little tiny card, and it's like basically, you're supposed to take it with you, and you could, like, hand it to anybody when, say you were at, like, a bar and some guy was, like, talking to you and you didn't want him to talk to you. You hand him this card and it said, like, "I don't" basically, like, "Don't bother me, I'm here because I wanna be alone," or something like that.
Oh, okay.
Um,
Oh.
and, even that, like, if you handed that to someone in a bar, they'd think you were a total crazy bitch.
Yeah.
But, it's just like, I wanna be left alone. Is that too much to ask? So I think that little
Mhm.
card was a really great sort of the most innocuous thing, like a tiny little piece of paper with, like, printed on it these words, and I think
Yeah.
that was probably thought of as like, "Oh, that's anger," um,
Yeah.
in some way or another.
No, I really love that, just the idea of classifying things as anger that's not when in reality it's just anything that's slightly against the grain, anything
Right.
that's taking a stance, and yeah,
Mhm.
I really love that.
But then, of course, there is real anger
Of
in
course,
Yeah.
art. There's a lot of that. I think that, like, the golden age of that is of, real emotional anger is probably, the 1970s and the feminist movement.
Mm, mhm.
Mhm.
Um, and, uh, just the various sort of, like, pieces of performance art where the lines really get blurred between, like, political action and art and performance. There's an artist, Suzanne Lacy, who did like a multi-day sort of action slash, I don't even know if you could it is an art piece, but it sort of doesn't feel like an art piece where she had a map of Los Angeles, and there were stamps of where rapes had occurred in the last 3
Mm.
weeks, and then she just had, people come and stamp where they had been, assaulted and tell their
Wow.
stories. And
Wow.
I'm sure, I don't think there are recordings of that, but I'm sure it veered into anger, into sadness, into a lot of
Absolutely.
like real, like
Yeah.
raw emotion.
How do you think maybe art before, like, the first and even second wave of feminism, before it became more mainstream, how do you think are do you have any examples of ways that women or a certain piece did demonstrate feminine rage and anger? Like I said, before feminism was something that was at least a little bit more widely accepted, in like the late 20th century.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I immediately think of Artemisia Gentileschi.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah. And her, images of like beheading Judith,
Yes.
beheading Holofernes, that being, pretty I never wanna, like, read biography totally into her work, but of course she was, raped at the hand of her teacher, and she was
Mhm.
put on trial. She was put on trial to prove
Yes.
her,
Yeah.
um, you know, I don't know, purity in some way. I mean, of course she wasn't pure in that way anymore, but to sort of test whether she was lying about the incident. But yeah, that is very even but, even other artists, I think of especially Baroque artists, so she was, of the Baroque, but there are other Baroque artists, Elisabetta Sirani, there are images because the Baroque was so animated and it was so
Mhm.
Mm.
dramatic already. I think that, I'm absolutely not a historian of that era, so I'm probably
That's
reading a
okay.
lot of, like, my 20th century, 21st century ideas onto it. But, like, there were a lot of because there was already energy and animation in those images, I think they're probably like, I can see this one image, and I'm pretty sure it is Elizabeth Sirani of someone in mythology, a woman, like, toppling a man into a well.
Mhm, mhm.
And I don't know the story, what it's depicting exactly, but, even that, like, the energy of that, which is
Mhm.
already sort of like an aspect of the art movement at that moment, really allows for that expression of anger, or
Yeah.
of some sort
Mhm.
of revenge or whatever. So I think that's just a really lovely, but
In a
clever
way,
way of sort of,
yes.
like,
Mhm.
masking these things.
No, that's really cool. Do you think that, like, then the reception of art pieces has changed over time, or what, or even, like, more historically versus, like, now, what do you think is, like, the public reception? I mean, not even public, but even critic reception, of things like that showcase that?
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about this as thinking of the 70s as being this sort of pinnacle, and then
Mhm.
us sort of, like, receding from that for the last, like, several decades.
Mhm.
I think of, like, the like, feminist art in the 80s starts to become, like, a lot more layered behind, as we were saying, those, like,
Yeah.
intellectual, sort of interpretations, and it gets a lot sort of colder. Like, if you think about
Mm.
Jenny Holzer's truisms, the, whatever, abuse of power comes as no surprise, or all of those statements, and Barbara Kruger too, your gaze hits the side of my face, or, um, any number uh, of of her sort of very pithy, very, powerful statements.
Yeah.
But the hand of the artist comes out, and, like, the identity of the artist comes out. Like, even in Artemisia Gentileschi, like, she's painted herself as Judith,
Mhm.
whereas you have a statement saying something, very emphatic about the state of the world, about, misogyny or whatever, but it's unclear who's made it. And, like, that artist, not only, like, is she not referencing herself, but she's also, she hasn't taken a brush, and her
Mhm.
handwriting isn't
Yeah.
in it, her mark isn't in it. Um, and I think that, yeah, I think that's very much like what the 80s and onward were concerned about, like conceptual art, and much more like that was definitely the trend. So I can see why the
Totally.
artist wanted to be like, well, look, like, I am part of this movement. Like,
Mhm.
I am going to be taken seriously. And so I'm going to sort of filter this all, this
Mhm.
feeling, this anger, this emotion or whatever, through a different lens to be taken seriously.
Interesting. What do you think
Yeah.
it was then about, like, the '70s? Why was that the pinnacle, do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think this, and yeah.
I wonder. That's
Um
what I'm like, I wonder if it's, like, after that people were, like, jaded of, like, "Oh, and nothing happened." What happened in history that maybe caused that to feel less personal? I don't
I'm
know.
always
right.
thinking about, like, we've talked about this, the kind of recession of feminism in the 90s and early 2000s. I
Mhm.
kind of wonder if it's maybe like that too, where it's just like it became a dirty word, People had to
Right.
start contextualizing it more to kind of hide that because people were sick and tired of hearing it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's, yeah, absolutely. That maybe it was, too much.
Yeah.
That anger
Yeah.
was, yeah, it needed
Like,
to have
they
some sort of backbench.
the raw emotion was a little bit too strong that people were like,
Mhm.
not that.
Yeah.
Not like that."
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wonder how, just throwing the question back at you, I
Mhm.
Totally.
I feel like there isn't as much female anger on display today.
Mhm.
Mhm.
I wonder also if, the 80s actually were sort of a moment where the art market really started to blow up, and
Mm.
art was being traded much more as a commodity.
Mhm.
Um, and and then that has only continued. So I wonder if there's a connection between those things, and if your
Yeah.
anger isn't saleable, especially
Yeah.
female anger.
And especially if, like, the focus was like, "Oh, cool, we can sell these things and make money," then, like, that's the focus as opposed to, like, "How can I evoke my strong emotions into the art piece?" Like, I guess that would make sense of, like, well, if the emphasis is what I can sell, yeah,
Right.
let's ignore that and make art that is sellable. Yeah,
Right. And I think
interesting.
that, yeah, I think that goes along with like girl boss feminism,
Mm.
Yeah.
and this sort of feminism is, I think the 80s would definitely support that. Like the power
Yeah.
suit, like
Yeah.
the woman who's like, okay, I'm gonna be like one of the guys now. Like I can be,
Mhm.
the powerful CEO. I can make money. I can, be, yeah, I think sort of success and power became what feminism was after, rather than yeah, I think it's sort of like the lean in kind of philosophy. Like,
Yes.
yeah, be more male rather than like express and
And
accept being
Yeah.
female.
I guess that's
mhm.
the thing about feminine rage. It is inherently feminine. Both
Right,
are
Yeah.
trying
right.
to
Yeah.
Yeah. You have to
Yeah.
allow that to be
Mhm.
feminine in some yeah, in some way or
Yeah.
Right.
another.
Exactly.
If you ignore that, then yeah, to become more masculine to fit into the man's world, yeah, it's different. It changes it. And that's what like I think you have to actively suppress in order to thrive if that's your
Hmm.
focus.
Yeah.
So, it makes
No, that
sense.
makes sense with the 80s.
So I wasn't around then, so I don't know.
That's true. This
Us
is
too.
pure speculation. A very good point. So you said with today then, like, can you think of any, like, more modern I know you mentioned, the exhibit from the MoMA just a couple years was a couple years ago? Yeah?
Yeah, probably
Yes.
2017.
Okay,
Okay.
awesome. But, yeah, any other, like, examples of, like, modern art in this more recent years that you can see of, like, someone expressing that feminine rage or anger?
Yeah, let me think. I just think, I don't know. I feel like, especially in the last couple of years, I just read a great article about like why sort of like girly, sort of feminine, very, like Bose and other
Mhm.
Mhm.
and Mary Janes and things like that. All these sort of like very girly, and Barbie too, and Pink and Barbie, and
Mhm.
all this stuff that has been very very popular for women in the last couple years has been, because being an adult female is just so unappealing.
Yeah.
Of course, we would go back to trying to
If you
be
ever
little girls because that
Mhm.
was more fun than like having to fight for, bodily autonomy and all of this
Yeah.
stuff.
Mhm.
So I think that like, in the face of, you can go sort of two directions. You can go angry, which feels, yeah, more sort of active, and then, or you can like sort of revert to something where that feels safe.
Mhm.
And I think that for
Mm.
whatever reason, we've like chosen safety rather than anger.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I really, when I think of like contemporary art, I think of like really, like I think of like Anna Wyant, like really just sort of like, there's like sadness and in
Mm,
her work, but mostly it's just sort of like, this is, oh, I'm a millennial. There's not a lot of challenge in
Mm.
it. I think of like there being a lot of interior spaces that are very popular to paint in contemporary art. um, or there's like fantasy, like imagining alternative realities. Like I think like
Mm.
Afrofuturism is really big.
Yeah.
Imagining like, okay, well, this sucks. So what would be better? How about
Yeah.
this world that doesn't exist, either in like our fantasy of being young again, or our fantasy in like being in a different
uh,
planet as a
yeah.
different,
Mhm.
race of people almost. So yeah, I don't know.
Fair.
I don't really see much
That's
anger.
that's so interesting though because I especially like with last year with like the Barbie movie and Taylor Swift and
Yeah.
Beyonce,
Right.
there was like so much like this is the year of girl and that was so
Right.
fun, of course, but like that's such an interesting point of the idea of like, we're dealing with things now and it's like how do you respond to it? And like I don't know what's better or worse, but it's like that is another end of the spectrum where instead of being angry and saying like, "No, like this is what needs to change," it's like, "Well, let's go back to when I did last feel safe." And I felt really
Right.
Yeah.
safe when I was a child and
Right.
embracing those things, which like it's great that we're, not shaming those things anymore. And yeah, it's interesting. I think we're all like responding to like, you know, I at least personally would, like, shame myself growing up of, like, "Oh, this is lame that I'm doing this," when that was just girly, you know?
Right.
So,
Yes.
it's like both, sides of the same coin, but I think that's, like, really interesting that it's, like, that's actually reverting to where it's safe instead of maybe being
I
angry. Yeah.
almost wonder too, like, this is spitballing, but, like, talking about kind of taking the safe option might be because, like you talked about, this isn't a fun era to be a
Mhm.
woman, and it
Yeah.
doesn't feel safe, and I think especially, like, post Me Too and realizing that it did some good, but it didn't change as much as I think a lot of us were
Right.
hoping it would.
Yeah.
Especially, like, overturning of Roe v. Wade, like, maybe people are afraid to kind of express that indignation again because people are like, "We're sick and tired of hearing about it." And so it
Yeah.
kind of is the safe option again.
No, I think you're probably right
Yeah.
yeah, once you've tried so many times and you're just so clearly rejected,
Yeah.
Yeah.
um, especially when it comes to sort of like the law and precedent. I mean, yeah, I think
Yeah.
the overturning Roe v. Wade was just a sort of shocking, like, you,
Yeah.
it's sort of like not fine. It's one thing if you have attitudes that are a certain way, but it's the sort of like entrenching, and also because it was just such a shocking reversal of precedent. I mean,
Yeah.
it is the law is the ground that we're standing on, and that was just
Mhm.
pulled out. So it makes sense. I think that
Yeah.
the energy for anger is not there because it's been expended
Like, you can only
for
really
nothing.
be angry for so long before it
Yeah,
doesn't feel
Yeah.
useful anymore.
No, that's true.
exactly.
Do you feel like the art market at this point, if there were to be, like, a renaissance of feminine rage, would it be something that could work in that area and space?
I mean, this is part of the reason why I am so much of an advocate for getting more women into the art market as
Mhm.
art buyers.
Mhm.
That's like I call it matronage.
Mhm.
Taking back that word, becoming matrons of the arts.
Yeah.
And that is, you know, I think it's probably a pretty big ask to get a male art collector to put an image of feminine rage above his
True.
couch.
Yeah.
But I think a woman could find, solidarity in that. And I
Mhm.
think that the buyer, not to say there aren't enlightened men out there, but I would say the buyer for works like that would be more likely to be someone who also felt kind of that kind of anger.
Yeah.
Um, so so yeah, if we can have like a renaissance, or not even a
Yeah.
renaissance, if we can just have a blossoming of female collectors,
Yeah.
maybe feminine rage will get become more in vogue.
I love that phrase, the matron of the arts.
I do too. That's
I want to
awesome.
be a
Yeah.
matron of the arts.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Love that.
you gotta own it.
Own it, matron of the arts. Yeah, I guess that was honestly when you just said that, I was like, "Oh yeah, patron of the arts." That is, like,
Yeah.
masculine. Yeah,
Totally,
I, like,
totally
never even
masculine.
internalized that. Like, that's not
Totally.
just the word, that's, like, the masculine version of that.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Exactly. Exactly.
Never had
No,
thought
it's one
about
of those. I mean, I wish I had my hat here, but I have a hat that says it should, um,
That's awesome.
Oh, I love that. That's cool. Need that hat. Matron of the arts. Amazing. Well, is there anything else that, you wanted to touch on? If not, we can wrap up. If you
let
do
me
have
look at
more, we
my
will take more.
yeah. I guess contemporary in the contemporary way, I think of, I mean, this isn't artists, but like the soup throwing, food throwing food at art, that's
Yeah.
become so popular these days. Like that's anger and art. That's
Yeah,
just it's
true.
just yeah, I'd have to think more about that, but certainly that's a place where it shows up, and it's I guess it's the sort of the prestige of certain pieces of art and the respect that they gain like heightens, I don't know, that anger butting up against it. To me, those instances are so interesting
Mhm.
because there is this sort of like sterility to the works. They're behind
Yeah.
glass, they're like behind ropes, they're you know, sort of perceived to be like impermeable
Mm.
and like sort of never changing. And then you have this like the contrast of course, like food and sort of dirtiness of that, but also the anger and the emotion that comes up against that. And we are used to having art be like an expression of like human whatever emotion
Mhm.
experience, but you really see how the art museum has like leached a lot of that from art.
Yeah. That's such a
um
good point. I feel like that makes me feel a little bit better about this drawing. I've been kinda like,
right.
"What the heck?"
Exactly.
And I'm like, "Oh,
um
it's performance art."
In a
right, right,
way.
right, right.
Mhm.
Yeah. And of course there are a lot of women who are those protesters. There are a lot of
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of them aren't women, but yeah. So I think that was one of my pieces,
That's
one of
an
my notes.
interesting, yeah, way to
Yeah,
bring
no,
that
it's a
up.
good way to look at it.
It's a strong
And then I
point.
would just wanted to show this work, which I
Yeah.
think is a great
Ooh.
expression. This is the goddess Kali. It's by Sutapa Biswas, and it's this sort of she's sort of like a warrior goddess, which exists in various like Athena is a warrior, like a god of war, goddess of war.
Yeah.
Um, so I think that's interesting when you have the female sort of destroyer, but she's sort of holding machete, and she is supposed to be this. That is the artist has depicted herself, but this
Mm,
sort of
cool.
destroyer, Indian British artist, and she's sort of just decapitate. You see these like decapitated
Yeah.
heads of like
Yeah.
white men, and she's holding this head, and she's sort of destroyer of colonialism, and yeah, it's quite a good work. That's from
Uh,
1985.
and what is
So
that
Love
book
that.
that you have?
oh, this is a book. It's called Visibly Female. It's just an
Cool.
anthology of essays.
Oh, sweet.
Um,
Cool.
I think it was from the 80s, but yeah,
No, yeah, I love
1987.
that.
So yeah, that was my last. I just one of the questions was, do you have specific works? And I think
Yes.
that's a particularly interesting work.
Yeah,
No,
I
thank
love
you.
that.
And I feel like you've given us so many like great specific examples of like artists and works as well. So thank you so much. I personally like that is where my blinders are with the podcast is like current visual art world.
Right.
So
Yeah,
thank you
that's
for
true.
being our resident expert at this point.
Absolutely. No, exactly. I'm always happy to fill in those blanks.
Amazing.
Another recommendation would be this book, Art Monsters: Unruly Bodies in
Ooh.
Feminist Art by Lauren Elkin, which is, yeah, all about, I mean, definitely about anger, but
Yes.
also about just sort of not fitting into the female mold,
Mhm.
the sort of expectation of being pleasant, of being a wife, of being a mother, of being, you know, not making waves as a
Yeah.
woman artist. So I think that's a great
Yeah.
read.
Ah,
Oh, I
And
love
that came
that.
out
incredible.
like last year.
Oh, cool.
Perfect. Thank you for the
Yeah,
recommendation.
Yeah.
absolutely.
We probably should have started with this, but before we wrap up, do you wanna tell us just what, like, feminine rage means to you personally?
That's a really good question. I think it has a lot to do with I think I personally grew up with I went to an all girls school for up until the senior year of high school,
Mhm.
and I never like questioned my ability or my intelligence. I think I was as my parents also encouraged, they really honored that
Yeah.
piece of myself. I wouldn't say they yes, I think that I was, that was a like important facet of who I was and my identity, and I think my parents recognized that and that it was important to me, and they also
Mm,
thought that I was intelligent, which I appreciated.
yeah.
And so for that reason, I think that for me, feminine rage comes from this like severe disconnect between, and this is like when I get angry in life, it comes from a severe disconnect between like what I know to be the truth about like women being like so fundamentally capable and equal, and then the way that that's clearly not recognized in the world.
Mhm.
And when I am a pretty like calm person. I am pretty, introverted, but the thing that can like snap me into anger is when I'm underestimated,
Mhm.
especially by a man, but like in
Yeah.
conversation or like when clearly there's something that I'm being read through like lens of like a stereotype or whatever. And yeah, that just sets me off. So yeah, I think it's like, yeah, trying to fill that gap between like what I know is true and what people for some reason see. And yeah, I would say like I have no doubt in my mind about the validity of women.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And that's like the core of it. It's just sort of like, how are you seeing the world differently from me? Because this is the truth. So
Beautiful
there, that's a
Oh,
answer.
good way
thank
to
you.
end, I
I love
guess.
Mhm.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. And then last, of course, but not least, where can people find more about what you're doing? What would you like to shout out?
Yeah. Well, my company is called Less Than Half. I can't believe I honestly should have mentioned the Gorilla Girls because they are like the most
Hmm.
I mean, they're very angry and rightly
Mhm.
so.
Yes.
But yeah, the Gorilla Girls. Less Than Half comes from one of their posters, but my company's called Less Than Half. You can find me at lessthanhalf.org. And yeah, I have all sorts of things. I'm developing these different courses to teach people about women artists. If you want to learn
Amazing.
how to collect art or learn how to find affordable art, like I've got resources on all. So
Awesome.
Amazing.
yeah,
Well, thank
Yeah,
you
thank you
so
so
thank
much
you.
much.
for coming back and, yeah, talking about being angry with us.
No problem. That was a lot of fun. And as I said, you gave me a lot to think about. So
Good.
I'll be reflecting on this for March and beyond.
That's the
Awesome.
goal. Definitely.
Yes.
Welcome to March Madness. Yeah.
Amazing.
Whenever, yeah, someone in the talking about basketball, like, no, no, no.
Right.
We're rebranding it. Feminine
Exactly.
Yes.
rage.
Excellent. I love it.
Perfect.